All right, so we're going to start the Forestry for the Birds webinar. My name is Keith Phelps, and I'm a forestry outreach specialist with UW Extension Forestry. I'm going to introduce you to our other presenters here. Mike, if you want to go first.
I'm Mike Demchik, Professor of Forestry at University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Riddle. I'm a wildlife professor here at Stevens Point.
Awesome. So before we hear from Jason and Mike, I want to mention some brief housekeeping items. During Jason and Mike's presentation, please be sure to keep yourself muted so you can find this option at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. The microphone, just make sure that there's that red slash through it. This webinar is also being recorded for future reference. My colleague, Tony Johnson, is now going to drop an anonymous demographic survey into the chat. The survey is completely voluntary for you to fill out. It does help us at Extension, so if you could fill it out, we would greatly appreciate it. We will also share the survey link at the end of the webinar if you forget about it. So the webinar is first going to have Jason speak on forest bird ecology and habitat needs of specific Wisconsin forest birds. Mike is then going to, Jason will, my apologies, Jason will follow to discuss forest management for bird habitat, and we'll do questions at the end. Finally, I would like to do an update on our field tours. Unfortunately, due to low enrollment numbers, we've decided to cancel our first field tour, which was Clark County on June 14th, and we're now only going to be hosting one field tour. For those of you who have already registered, we did send out a poll to indicate your preference of the two remaining field sites, which would be Village of Plover on June 21st or Taylor County on June 28th. So based on the site with the highest interest, we will pick that location as our field tour site. We'll send an update on the final location to everybody who has registered and everybody on the Zoom email. And hopefully we'll kind of provide the final location early to mid next week after that poll closes. If you are able, please do sign up for that final location, as we would love to see you there in person and talk all things birds and forestry. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to our presenters to begin the webinar content.
Okay, thank you. Are you able to see my screen okay?
Yep.
All right, great. So again, my name is Jason Riddle. I work here at UW-Stevens Point and the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, and I also have an appointment with UW Extension. So I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction to two different kinds of birds that we get here in the state, resident birds and neotropical migratory birds. I have a few objectives with this. First is just to provide a brief overview of the ecology of resident birds, and then to do the same with the ecology of neotropical migrants. And in doing so, I'm going to try to touch on some of their habitat needs. So, what is a resident bird? For our purposes, a resident bird is one that stays in the state of Wisconsin for the entire year. And as all of you Wisconsin residents know, you have to be ready for all of our seasons, both of them, pothole season and that one day of summer. Just kidding. These birds have to be adapted to all four of our seasons. And so a bird that we'll go into more detail about later that fits the bill as a resident is the ruffed grouse. Here you can see a male kind of in full display. The species is considered a resident because it spends its entire year in basically the same range. Right, its summer breeding habitat and its winter habitat are in such close proximity to each other that they don't have to migrate further south. And so within the state of Wisconsin, this species is generally associated with cover types in the North Woods, and comes a little further south once you get over into the driftless area. Before we go into more detail about this bird, I just want to highlight some other examples of resident birds. Some of them are really spectacularly colored, like our northern cardinal. Some of them are cute but feisty, like this black-capped chickadee that you might get at your feeders. Others look like some kind of throwback to the prehistoric days, like our giant pileated woodpeckers. Others are really charismatic and sometimes are at the center of controversies about land use, such as our greater prairie chicken. And then finally, one of our largest resident birds, the wild turkey, which I don't think there's an artist on the planet that could paint a more beautiful bird with iridescence and earth tones as you get with our wild turkeys. But part of the point I really want to emphasize with resident birds is that even though they don't move across the country or to other continents to migrate, they still have needs that can really vary as we move through the seasons. And for these kinds of birds in particular, all of those needs, both breeding season and winter needs, have to be met in a relatively small space when compared to migratory birds. So we'll get into a little more details about what that can look like with the ruffed grouse here. So the ruffed grouse is considered kind of a solitary bird. The males and females don't really interact with each other very much outside of copulation. Males can occupy a home range as small as about 5 or 10 acres. The female home ranges have a little more variability. They can be quite a bit larger than the male home ranges, and usually male and female home ranges will overlap a bit. It tends to be the males that don't want other males inside of their home ranges. This is a chicken-sized bird, but it has a relatively short lifespan. Usually they don't live more than a couple of years or so. And they're what I call a ground-bound bird. They're strong flyers, or at least they can take off, vertically like a helicopter, and can really give you a good scare when you're not expecting to kick one up in the woods. But like a lot of upland game birds, most of the places they go, they get to on foot, and often only fly to escape predators or grab food from the treetops from time to time. But a really fun bird. This picture here is one that our student chapter of the Wildlife Society provided. This is a male grouse on his drumming log, trying to advertise himself to any females that might be listening in the wee hours of the morning here. You can see the sun just coming up over the horizon. So to kind of demonstrate in the case of grouse and their food, how their needs change as we move through the seasons, I put this graphic together. We'll start with the chicks. They really want insects. They're basically like these little protein vacuums that scour the woods when they hatch out in late spring and into the early summer. And they're chasing down all the bugs they can find. But for the first weeks of life, that's almost exclusively what they're going to eat are insects. The adults will also eat insects, but during the summer months, adults will supplement their insect diet with succulent plant parts and also fruits. they'll continue to eat on those things through the fall, but by the time we get to winter, foods are quite a bit more woody. They're eating the buds on deciduous trees, parts of twigs, and catkins, which will be these little clusters of flowers that may still be out there during the winter time. So again, the purpose of this graphic is just to demonstrate that they're not eating the same things uh, all the time, that their diets vary as they come out of the breeding season and into the summer, and then change quite a bit moving into the winter months. But I do want to really emphasize the role that aspens play in providing food directly or indirectly for the species in our neck of the woods. Um, Many of the plant parts that these birds are eating are from aspen, and then the decomposing leaf litter that aspen leaves on the forest floor is great for the kinds of insects that these chicks are after. So in Wisconsin, at least, aspen, it plays a really important role for grouse ecology. Their needs in terms of vegetative or plant cover, I think, are even more complex than their diet. Uh, Males during the spring are perching on these drumming logs and trying to advertise their territories, either to keep other males out or to attract females. They like logs that are often in younger aspen stands. Uh, so a little thicker ground cover, higher stem density, whereas females are thinking more about nest sites. Females will often build a nest on the ground that's close to a stump or a rock, and the places where they will put nests look quite a bit different than the places where you might find a drumming log. The female is kind of like an open understory, presumably so that they can see predators as they might be approaching, but a closed overstory. So really different male and female needs here. Maybe one analogy would be that the males with their logs and dense aspen cover are kind of looking for a comfy couch inside their fortress of solitude, whereas the females in their nest sites are looking for a roof overhead with an open concept interior architecture. As eggs hatch, mom will move her brood into younger aspen and even into some forest openings, as long as they're not much wider than about 100 feet across. Basically, she's trying to get those little ones to the places where they can find lots and lots of insects. So their cover needs are shifting a bit, especially in the case of females as we go from spring to summer. If you're in the woods in the fall, you could kick up some younger grouse that is grouse that hatched earlier that same year in a variety of cover types, because these young grouse are trying to find their own territories for the next year. So you may find grouse in places that look kind of nonsensical in terms of habitat types because they could be making poor choices about the kinds of places that where they're trying to set up territories. But the birds that have survived the fall and make it into the winter are generally looking for mature aspen stands in our state. But it's important to note that these mature aspen stands still have some pockets of diversity in them. So grouse will often use mature aspen that has patches or components of conifers or even young oaks that will keep their leaves on through the winter. And so especially if the mature aspen is within 100 feet of some of these pockets, that can be really critical. But these conifer areas and oaks that retain their leaves are important kind of thermal refugia. That is, they retain some heat, and these grouse will get into those spaces, especially when conditions are really difficult. So as you can see, even though this species has a relatively short lifespan, and has a relatively small home range, it uses really different foods within that small space. And the males, females, and fledglings have fairly unique requirements, especially during the spring and summer months. So even though they don't migrate, it doesn't mean that they don't have a complicated life history. Okay, so that was an example of habitat needs for one of our resident birds. For the rest of my talk, I'll be focusing on these neotropical migratory birds, which is a mouthful, so sometimes we just abbreviate them as NTMBs or refer to them as neotrops. What is a neotropical migratory bird? These are birds that breed here in North America, but that they will migrate to the New World tropics of Central and South America, or some of the islands in between. And one of the most impressive examples of this in terms of migration distance is the blackpoll warbler. So this image is from a poster where folks were communicating the results of a geolocator study. So you can see this stylized image of a blackpoll warbler has a little backpack on that helps researchers to track their movements. And so for some of these birds, they were nesting as far north and as far west as Nome, Alaska. And then they're making movements across the entire continent, moving over Canada and making their way to the eastern seaboard. And when they're headed south for the winter, they're really stocking up on as many calories as they can at these stopover sites, because once they make the jump for this transoceanic movement to cross the Atlantic and make it down to the kind of the northern edge of South America, this could be nonstop flights for many of these birds. And one study compared this, the Atlantic leg of their migration, in terms of energetics, to a human running a 4-minute mile for 80 hours. So it's just a spectacular feat for these really small birds. Then they'll spend the winter here and kind of repeat this process in reverse for the next breeding season. So these neotropical migrants are really impressive. There's a couple of hundred species of those that you might find here throughout the Midwest, but some of the ones that I want to focus on here are ones that we encounter with different levels of frequency when we're in the woods doing bird surveys. Some of these birds, as you'll see, are pretty spectacular, or at least have some pretty unique features, like this red-eyed vireo, appropriately named for its fiery red eye. I sometimes joke that they have red eyes because they never sleep. This is a bird that you can hear calling all day long for huge parts of the summer. Great crested flycatcher is another bird that you might hear in our neck of the woods. The orchard oriole, which is just a gorgeous bird. One of my favorites from the days that I spent in the Southern Appalachians is the black-throated green warbler. We heard several of those this past week while we were doing bird surveys. This beautiful bird, which is a Canada warbler. Another one of my favorites from down south that's starting to creep its way up into the southeast part of the state, I believe, is the blue grosbeak. Black and white warbler, which I sometimes call the zebra of the sky. Scarlet tanager, which looks like it has a paint job that would make a race car jealous. And then one of many birders' favorites up here is the black Burnian warbler, which one of my colleagues refers to as looking like a little torch that's lit up in the top of trees. So many of these neotropical migrants are just gorgeous birds, like this Cape May warbler. But they pose some pretty significant management challenges. One, in order to manage and conserve these birds properly, it requires effort across both the northern and southern hemisphere, right? So these birds are using habitats that span multiple continents in some cases. That makes them hard to study, right? So there's much less known about some of these migratory birds than our resident birds, just because you know they may move to places over the winter where there's not funding to study them, or they're just harder to track because they're in places with lower human populations. And their habitat needs can be complicated by the fact that the things they need during the winter are going to be quite different than what they need while they're en route during migration, and they may have different needs still once they end up at the breeding grounds. So in my last handful of slides, we'll be considering two examples of neotropical migratory birds that I consider to be on different ends of the spectrum in terms of simple or relatively flexible habitat needs versus those that get a little bit more complicated. So for our first example, this is one of my favorite birds. This is the indigo bunting, which I think looks like a little piece of the sky that just came to life. The range of the indigo bunting is shown in this map. For this map and the one that follows, anything that you see here in blue is where they spend the winter. So for the bunting, you can see that's in the kind of southern parts of Central America, the very northern part of South America, and then on some of the islands in between. Its breeding range is fairly expansive. It covers most of the east and central US, parts of the west, and then what you see here in yellow are places where it's not going to breed and it's not going to winter, but in the words of Bob Dylan, it's just passing through. This bird has a fairly flexible dietary strategy. It's an omnivore, which is just a fancy way of saying that it will eat all kinds of things. Insects, fruits, seeds, pretty flexible. But let's think about the kinds of vegetation cover types it might use when it's en route when it's en route during migration. So if you had a bird that started down here in Central America and was on its way to Wisconsin, maybe following the coast here, and then working its way up through the Mississippi Flyway, that bird, for this species, will use a variety of cover types. So grasslands, shrubs, farm fields, even people's yards. When it's in the woods, it's probably going to tend to use kind of deciduous cover types. And it'll do that all the way up until maybe it gets here to central Wisconsin. And there it's going to be thinking about the sorts of places to put its nest. This bird builds a traditional cup-shaped nest, usually situated in some closely oriented branches in a shrub or tree, usually anywhere from 3 feet to 30 feet off the ground. It's often found kind of at the interface of forests and ag fields, but you can also find them all over the place in regenerating cutover. old fields that have been abandoned. And you can find them deeper in the woods in canopy gaps. So these would be places that would be a break in the overstory, maybe because of a wetland or a stream, or where one or more large trees have fallen into the ground and created an opening. You'll get kind of some shrubby or scrubby vegetation coming up in those places, and buntings will find those and nest there. This bird will have at least one brood per season. Many of them will have 2 and 3 broods are possible in years where you have spruce budworm outbreaks. Those babies, once they leave the nest and they're considered fledglings, seem to use the same sorts of habitats as where the nests were built. So one of the reasons I started with this bird as a neotropical migrant is that many of the same kinds of vegetative features are used in migration, nesting, and fledgling, right? That this bird's an omnivore, and as long as there's some shrubs or some kind of early vegetation, early successional vegetation component, this bird seems to do okay, right? It will use those spaces. So I consider this relatively simple and flexible. We'll contrast that with this next neotropical migratory bird. This is the ovenbird, which is one of our larger warblers. And this map can be interpreted like the last one that you saw, right? It has a winter range that looks a lot like the indigo bunting, but its breeding range is definitely more northward than the indigo bunting. And there's fairly large swaths of the southeast and some parts of the central United States that this bird just passes through. Its diet is more restrictive than the indigo bunting. This bird is really going to focus on eating insects. Most of the time it's eating insects off the ground, but every now and then they'll hover and pick insects off of plants, or they'll even chase insects on the wing. So if a bird was headed towards central Wisconsin and it started out down here in Central America and was working its way up to us during migration, it's mostly going to use forested cover types. It doesn't seem too picky about the kind of forest that it's in, and it may even use forest edges. But once it makes its way to central Wisconsin and is thinking more about the place where it wants to put its nest, it's thinking more about conditions on the ground. So this is a ground nesting bird, and it actually gets its name because the nests that it builds in the leaf litter look kind of like an old-fashioned oven, like a little dome with an opening off to one side. These birds only have 1 brood a year, usually with 4 or 5 eggs. Even though they'll use quite a variety of forest types on their way north to us, once they're here, the conventional wisdom is that they're looking for mature deciduous forests, or maybe mature mixed forests, that is, forests that have some deciduous trees and some evergreen trees. Although, as Mike might mention later, we do find these birds in pine stands sometimes, depending on what the ground or nearby conditions are like. But generally, these birds don't want a lot of plants growing right at the forest floor, right? They want things a little more open in the understory, and generally they're looking for lots of leaf litter, probably to forage in, but also for some good nest building material. So We usually think about these birds as nesting in these forests with more mature and larger trees, but things get a little more complicated for this species once they're ready to move their young out of the nest and off to forage, to begin foraging on their own. When this happens, these birds will sometimes move their young out of these more mature forests and into some regenerating clear cuts or younger forests. And a study in Minnesota found that the fledglings have the highest survival rates when they are getting moved to some of these regenerating timber harvest, or at least finding patches within these mature woods that have a dense understory. So while they want a mature forest for nesting, the young often get taken to places with fewer trees and more shrubs. And specifically in this study in northern Minnesota, these patches of regenerating forests were usually within a few hundred feet or so of the nest site. So think, about a football field's in proximity, and that those birds had much higher survival rates as young birds than those that didn't have access to these understory features. So that was a brief background about resident bird ecology and neotropical migratory bird ecology. Some of the complexities, again, if there is, one or two takeaway messages from my part of today's webinar, it would be that birds have different needs as we go from the breeding to the non-breeding season. In the case of our resident birds, those all have to be met in a relatively small space. But even these migratory birds have a variety of needs while they're here to breed, but things get much more complicated for them as they migrate back and forth from the New World tropics to us. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
And so now I'll ask you the same question, Jason. Do you see my screen? Okay. So I'm going to talk about most heavily focusing on neotropical migratory birds and then how to generate the habitat. So I'm going to start with kind of a basic silviculture system summary. So we have silvicultural systems, or ways we manage timber, that include coppice, clear cut, and overstory removal. That's a system where we take the top off the stand. Seed tree and shelter wood. Uneven age management that's broken into three categories: single tree selection, group selection, and patch selection. And I'm going to show you photos of all of these. Irregular shelter wood, which is a system where you do mixed treatments. And finally, thinning, which is not really a system at all, and I'll explain that here in a minute. So coppice, overstory removal, and clear cut are three names for a system that actually silviculturally have a lot similar. You're basically going in and removing most of the overstory. So in this site, we've clear cut it. There's some reserve trees. I have some swamp white oak and white pine that I kept as reserve trees on there. In this case, this is a coppice. My intent is for the aspen that was on the site to resprout. And now that aspen's about 20 feet tall since that photo was shot. Clear cut is where you're intending to come back in and replant, and overstory removal is where you get a whole bunch of baby trees and you're pulling the top off to release them. This is shelter wood system. So shelter wood and seed tree are systems where you keep some overstory trees with the goal of either providing seed or nosing the seedlings along. So in this case, the shelter wood, you keep enough trees to provide light or to provide shade on the ground. So you favor things that are intermediate and shade tolerant. Things like our oaks are intermediate in our shade tolerance. Now, uneven age management has multiple different ways to be implemented. One is single tree selection, where you go through a site and you're removing individual trees, like this one that's marked in front of me here. Or where you're doing group selection, where you're cutting out pockets to get light to the ground. Or finally, patch selection, where you're cutting out significant size pockets. And finally, irregular shelterwood. Irregular shelterwood's kind of a system where you mix all of these. So on this site, and I was literally doing bird survey on this 6 hours ago today, you've got aspen coppice in the background here. In the background over here, you have conventional shelterwood where you're trying to get light to the ground. In the foreground on the right, you have a prep cut for shelterwood where you remove undesirable species, but you're still trying to keep shade on the ground. And on this left side, you thinned. Add 15 years. Those aspen in the back are 15 years old. This is established regen underneath, meaning you're ready to remove the overstory. This is ready to be shelterwood, and this still thinned. Add 15 more years. These trees in back are now 30. This is 15-year-old regen after the release. This is ready to have the top taken off, and this is ready to shelterwood. Add 15 years, and you can do it again. The idea on this system is through time, you can literally do this forever. You know, every 10 or 15 years, you can go in, do stand entry, and you always have some overstory. You always have some brand new regen. Now, thinning itself is not a system. If you look at this, it's like a step. So this stand had some storm damage. We went in and did release of the remaining trees. There's relatively little light getting to the ground after the cutting. Really, your focus is on releasing the trees that are already on site. So that's kind of to get us on the same page for terminology. I'm going to talk a little on birds here. So Jason talked about some species, and you'll see some crossover on these, but not a ton. We have some species that for either their nesting or their fledgling stage really require young and brushy stands. And so some of the classic ones are golden-winged warbler. That's one that is really probably of this list the most dependent on young and brushy for its nesting stage. Chestnut-sided warbler, woodcock, common yellowthroat, and I put a couple other photos up here. This one particularly, mourning warbler and yellow warbler, which are also pretty dependent on that. This is the kind of habitat you're looking at. So this is about 5 years after a coppice cut with reserves. So we kept conifer trees in there and some hardwood trees. And you get strong regeneration of that aspen that was cut. Site like this. So this site is one that had quite a bit of invasive species. What you see is a lot of invasive species removal with focus on retaining native species. And young brushy going to regenerate aggressively. Sites like this had significant storm damage. We came in, did cleanup on the storm damage and invasive control. And the impact, this was done in year 2019 and 2020, is that now we have a wall of regeneration on this site. This is that first photo you saw, the one where I mentioned coppice. And this is what the baby trees look like 2 years in. So for these birds in this young and brushy category, those wetland upland matrix is usually really important. So I mentioned golden-winged warbler. That one actually used to be called swamp warbler, if you go back long enough. They're ones that like alder, they like aspen, they like that interface of the shrub with like the sedges, or blackberries with like sedges, or possibly like the goldenrods. They're really a micro edge species. They stop using sites as they get older, so they really only want about a 5 to 15-year-old age range. And the males also need singing perches. They generally don't want to use conifers, they want to use hardwoods. So the impact of having individual trees left, clusters of trees left, and then parts of the stand that are open is pretty important for them. So that's our first class, our young and brushy birds. we have another class, which is group of birds that they like open canopies. They want an overstory, but they want it open, and they want gaps and shrubs. And so American redstarts are one of them. Veeries, very water associated bird, as are redstarts. Canada warbler, also pretty water associated bird, and then eastern wood pewee and white-throated sparrows. So each of these birds has specific requirements, and I mean, I'm going to go through each one of them a little bit later, but these pewees, as an example, this bird right here, that species is one that fly catches. It'll sit on the branches just like you see that one doing, and waiting to go out and catch insects in the air. They do much, much better in open canopies, forests that have been thinned. This little one right here, Canada warbler. I have been trying to get a photo of those that actually is not in the dark for years, and I've not been able to do it just simply because they're always in conditions that are extremely brushy. They favor nesting where you've had tree tips. They like wetlands where you've had tree tips. They either go up and under the tree tip or in the little holes where the roots pulled out of the ground. This photo was shot literally probably 5 hours ago at this point. That is a female American redstart, really selective on where they nest. They want to nest on the end of a short tree or tall shrub where the branches come out to the side. They basically want the main stem, branches off, really secure. They don't like super smooth bark. And if you notice on this individual bird, they've actually got spider webs holding the whole thing together. They pick a lot of spider silk for their nests. And if they don't have that habitat element, they don't have an effective place to nest. White-throated sparrows always end up calling the brush pile bird because they are one of the first ones to come in after a logging job and start to exploit it. And where you have material on the ground from the logging job, they love it. And finally, veeries. Veeries are associated with riparian areas. They will live either around lakes or they will live in areas around streams. And they generally need areas with tree tips, so you've a history of tree tips, so you have mounds and things of that nature. Sites like this, if I was to talk about what's a perfect set of redstart habitat, what you see here is we're going through an targeted removal of invasives on this site, but so many of those little branch structures I just talked about. This one right here is a good Canada warbler site. So I'm going to play the video and I'm going to play it slow and kind of talk you through what I'm seeing. Now notice this is in April. I know this site is a good Canada warbler site because I've shot photos of them out of this place and I hear them there every year. This is in April, so a lot of the ferns are still growing up yet. They want ferny and mossy ground. They generally want a history of wind damage in a site, and a lot of young brushy stuff coming in, but then older timber in the area, and ideally a lot of coarse wood on the ground. So stuff like this where you've had trees blow over in the past. And just like that last group, these wetland upland matrix habitats where you have wetland sites with pockets of upland are pretty important for those species. And for silviculture, every one of them I just talked about requires open canopy with disturbance history. And so that patch or group selection we talked about earlier, where you open the openings in the stand and let those younger trees come in, that's really good technique for getting them on the site. And most of them are pretty dependent on dense regeneration. Now, I have a subgroup of this because I didn't know really where the people that are attending would be coming from. These are more focused on the driftless part of the state. And Acadian flycatcher and Louisiana water thrush are the ones I'm calling a riparian reserve group. You can't tell looking at this site, but this slope is extremely steep. There's rock outcrops. There's a creek at the bottom of it. And in those elements, both those species are associated with wet woodlands. They really like ravines, so like these very steep slopes with the water at the bottom. And particularly Louisiana water thrush. I want you to imagine this small trout stream at the bottom. This tree over the years has been there, and through time it's continually got washed out, but it's continued to stand, and it's finally lost and gone. Now you have this big exposed root wad. This is leaning across the side of the creek. And those Louisiana water thrush will nest frequently up and under what I just described. So it's a very specific habitat element for them. And a site that includes savannas and barrens within this too, because I do quite a bit of work in those. And if you have a savanna or a barren, a savanna is an area that essentially has anywhere from 1 or 2 trees to acre up to about 50% crown cover. And barrens are just a really sandy version of a savanna functionally, really dry soils. You end up with species like grasshopper sparrow, clay color sparrow, and savanna sparrows, which are ones that nest in those clumps of grasses. And then the ones that have some brushy element like field sparrows, vesper sparrows, towhees, and brown thrashers. Brown thrashers tend to nest in areas, well, particularly where you have these oak grubs. So, oaks that are maybe 3-4 foot tall from stump sprouts. They like to nest right at the bottom of that. Towhees generally nest on the ground, but adjacent to pretty much exactly what I described for the brown thrasher. And vesper sparrows and field sparrows. Field sparrows particularly use variable habitat. They kind of ground nest for their first nest in spring, but when they hit their second nest, they usually target the brushier shrubs. And so if you have fields that have brushy edges with singular trees, they'll nest on the ground the first, and then as the season progresses in the shrubs right on those edges. And they're all awesome little birds, I guess. This photo is literally about 6 hours old as well. These sites provide a lot of habitat for other organisms. This is lupin. Lupin feeds Carner blue butterfly. Barrens are one of our most endangered ecosystems. The savannas and barrens represent single-digit or less percentages of what they used to cover on the landscape. And it's an early restoration on one of these sites. Essentially, we did quite a bit of cutting in there. We did chemical treatment and then seeding. These brown thrasher like kind of a little more cover than what the other ones that I mentioned do. They'll live in kind of boundary woodlands and are really dependent on those structures for nesting. So some important habitat elements in those worm season grass clumps. So those savanna sparrows, the vesper sparrows, the grasshopper sparrows, they all nest in those clumps of worm season grass. So if you don't have them, they don't do very well. They'll use things like orchard grass, which tends to be a cool season one that's clumpy, but they prefer the warm season ones. Tall forbs, so things like compass plants or other things in the field that can be places for those grasshopper sparrows to use as singing perches. Those shrubs and grubs, by grubs I mean resprouting oaks that with multiple stems. Partial areas of disturbance, so areas where you actually have some bare sandy ground. And then some cool season grass pockets. Birds like those vesper sparrows will use those. Birds like the clay color sparrow I showed earlier, they may nest in the brushier part, but then they forage in the grassier part. So some mixed habitats. And all of those are dependent on prescribed fire as a maintenance element. And finally, this is where we get a little crossover with what Jason talked about. We do have birds that are specifically associated with older woods. So we got our scarlet tanager and we got our ovenbird. And so for a scarlet tanager, they are very specific in nesting habitat if given a choice. They nest high in a tree. They generally like those branches that are out to the edge, and they want multi-tier branches. So the kind of forest condition you get where you have wide crowned oak trees as an example. So they got visual protection from above and below. That bird, if you go into New England, will use sites, a broader array of sites than they will in the lake states. They're a little more specialized here, and they're much more block sensitive. They like bigger parcels. They also tend to forage in open conditions. So even though they're pretty specific on their nesting requirement, their foraging with their chicks is in areas that are much more open. And by comparison, ovenbird, those things in New England really are pretty specialized in their habitat, but they are close to a generalist bird in the lake states. I have these things right behind my house. I have them, I find them all over the place. I have I've encountered some of the highest population of them's actually been in a pine stand in Juneau County, which I can't explain why. They just were. These conditions, so this ovenbird habitat, a lot of what I just described for all these other birds, ovenbird is kind of the opposite of this. So this is a northern hardwood stand, deep leaf litter, not much regeneration, beautiful timber quality. But ovenbirds are going to nest on the ground. They're going to make their nests in those little oven shapes that Jason was talking about, and they're going to ground forage like a little tiny chicken. I mean, they look like a little miniature chicken going along, moving their feet like just like a chicken would. And the more stuff you have on the ground for them, the worse it is for them. I actually consider this bird kind of to be positively impacted by deer browse. The deer browse eliminates a lot of these mid-story layers, and they're one of the species that's actually been increasing in population nationally. They love buildups of leaf litter. Scarlet tanager is a bird that can tolerate a lot more understory conditions, but is pretty selective on what it's looking for in the overstory. And it is particularly wanting oak timber if it's available. It will live in other sites. That photo actually you saw that I had earlier was one that didn't have oak timber and it was mostly maple. They just tend to have a preference for it. And because particularly the tanagers are a little bit disturbance sensitive, having pockets in properties where there are reserve islands, places that are not harvested, or portions of a property that aren't managed, or portions where you release individual crop trees and you release them from competition by cutting their neighbors so they can build those structures I mentioned in the trees, favor them. So I'm going to give a quick reminder here, and I hope this is okay with the two extension people that are facilitating this, but I'm going to have people just jump in and see if they can give answers on this. These young and brushy birds, the ones I was talking about were goldenwing and chestnut-sided warblers. These more patchy matrix birds are like woodcock and brown thrasher. The mature timber birds are like scarlet tanagers and ebonbird. And then the ones that are really wet, moist site birds, those red starts and veeries and Canada warblers. So here goes. Let's match the bird with the habitat. Okay, what we got? Who likes this? Which birds?
Feel free to unmute everybody.
Yeah, it makes it awkward being on Zoom for this.
It looks young and brushy to me. So chestnut-sided warbler.
Excellent. Chestnut, goldenwing, and we can also throw potentially brown thrashers and woodcock into that mix. So how about this? This is the Little Plover River, and that is immediately after the first restoration on the site. Riparian area, moist, very brushy edges coming back from native species, which what used to be buckthorn. Who we got that would like that? Well, I'm going to zip through for the awkwardness of Zoom here. American red starts and berries. This one right here, the back is a black ash wetland, which is now dead since the time of this photo. And you got balsam and you got cedar. So you got pockets of conifer in there, and you're developing quite a bit of shrub cover, particularly alder. And so Canada warbler really likes that kind of habitat. And finally, this old timber where you've got a single tree selection, you can see this is marked. They're actively cutting it at the time of this photo. And that's where I get my scarlet tanagers and ovenbirds. So the summary for the first part of this is this. A lot of these neotropical migratory birds are declining. And one thing that is of particular importance is these wetland upland matrix sites where you have wet sites, but then you have pockets of upland in them. They have some of our highest avian diversity. And finally, homogeneous woods are pretty negative for a lot of these birds. So managing to get structural diversity potentially cavities for nesting and coarse woody debris on the ground, and reduced invasive pressure. So that's the first part of this. The second slideshow I'm going to go through, I got this in 3 parts, is I'm going to talk a little bit, oops. Forgive me for that. That was a mistake. Or 2. There we go. A little more mid successional consideration. So a lot of the birds I just talked about are fairly young forest birds, but a lot of people have these forest sites that are kind of middle in age right now. They were cut at the turn of the century, and you end up with trees that are anywhere from 80 to 100 years old, and they may or may not have been managed. And for many of these, there's some pretty significant components of just landscape connectivity and block size. A 40-acre parcel that is really surrounded by ag land provides one picture to animals, whereas a 40-acre parcel that is attached to 3,000 acres of forest is a different picture for these animals. A lot of these stands are pretty structurally non-diverse. They're about the same age of stand. They don't really have very much vertical diversity. There's not much, mid-story growth, and there's not much horizontal diversity. There's not, open pockets in many of them. Many of these stands have relatively little dead and down wood in them. Then you have the element of some of them, rare, threatened, and endangered species are of interest. And finally, many of these are not very old stands. They're 80 to 100 years. So our managed forest tends to be pretty homogeneous in age structure. Most of them are about the same age. They, over time, if they have been managed, usually have not developed much structural diversity. They're pretty much the same trees that regenerated 80 to 100 years ago. And anytime something got sick or blew over, we came in and we salvaged the timber from it. So many of these don't have much standing dead or down timber now. And I have been accused repeatedly of making complexity out of simplicity. Many of these stands were being managed, followed relatively simple prescriptions, which could be carried out pretty easily. And a lot of the tinkering I do with this actually makes these stands a little harder for the loggers to manage longer term. There are things they have to pay more attention to. So a lot of what we're doing, we're trying to mimic windstorms, fire, and natural senescence. So these structural elements we are missing. So we generally want to have some very large trees on the site. In many of these cases, in these second growth forests, they've just not grown to the point of being gigantic yet. Ideally, these trees may be hard mass trees. They produce things like acorns, as an example. They may have cavities in them, so openings that can be used by a range of wildlife. Naturally, many of these stands would have followed this individuals, clusters, and openings. In response to fires and windstorm, you have some individual big trees that will have been reserved, some pockets that would have been missed, and then some big openings in it. A wide range of sizes, particularly in some places where you have really a large component of small stems, and then dead and down trees, and finally pit and mound topography, place where the trees have blown over in the past, so the landscape is wavy like that. That's particularly important for birds like veeries and hermit thrushes for nesting. So depending on harvest, you need portions of it that are young habitat, but they don't need to be in the same place. And so if you look at it through time, you do put openings in the stand, but those openings, those are going to fill with trees, and in 10 to 20 years, they're not going to be as attractive anymore to many of these species. And so you put different openings so that young habitat moves around the site. And you're also trying to create pockets of varying sizes. So in some places where you're able to do coppice, so you have those aspen stands I talked about, openings of some size are useful. In places where you can put bigger patches, maybe even up to 2 acres, those are pretty useful. and places where you can put smaller patches where you cut out like 60 feet of drip line to drip line for the trees. Those are useful. Trees that are important seed sources. Many of our stands have lost a lot of their yellow birch, for example, through time. So maintaining those trees as a seed source to get more yellow birch on the site, or potentially as structural trees, ones that birds can use because the microhabitat would be useful. And the last thing I'd say is remembering what this is going to look like when the stand is 40 years old. At this point, you look at an aspen stand that's been coppiced, and it's easy to look at it and see that 5 to 15 year range when it's going to be real vibrant for birds. It's a little harder to look at it and notice that in 40 years is going to be a pretty homogeneous, boring stand. And unless we keep some structures in it, like some conifer and hardwood reserves in the stand, we're going to have basically one age structure at 40 years, and it's going to be pretty boring for a lot of our wildlife. If we keep that structural diversity in it, by keeping some reserve trees or some pockets, we end up with a lot higher quality stand 40 years in the future. Now, if you look at this coarse woody debris right here, what I will tell you about this is we have very little of that on the landscape right now. Through time, when we've had trees that start getting sick, we have generally salvaged, and not many of our trees have gotten to that size. Intentional recruitment of this. So Jason would probably like this with his comment on grouse drumming logs earlier. Right now, you can't see this. This was a snag that was in the skinner of a skid trail, or what was going to be a skid trail. So I got the logger when we pushed this over so you could put the skid trail in place to move the snag and place it next to where the aspen coppice is going to be. Right now, that is buried under brambles and aspen and red elderberry, so you can't even see that that log is there. That serves as a place for drumming log for grouse, but it also serves a lot of other microhabitat features for amphibians as well. You can intentionally make these. I used to actually try to do these by getting the loggers to put them on the site, but there's too many skidder operators or forwarder operators that end up picking them up because they just can't track what's going on with it. So at this point, if I'm doing a logging job and I want some left as coarse woody debris on the ground, I usually reserve those trees and then come back and cut them myself. Elements like this, small controlled entry size, many of our neotropical migratory birds that end up using cavities in trees, they're actually subject to a lot of depredation from things like squirrels. So these small controlled cavity sizes are important for that. For animals like bats, they're also pretty relevant. Things like this where you can reserve them pretty easily. When I'm marking a site, I carry a green aerosol with me, marked W on the tree. In this case, it has barbed wire in the base of it, which facilitates it, and the top is already broken out. Maintaining those is quite useful for cavity nesting animals. Various components of standing dead in the site. Potentially structural reserves, individual trees I'm keeping on the site after a logging job that are going to be kept for, another 50 more years. Trees like this big white oak that provide foraging habitat in the bark, as well as provide acorns as hard mast. Coarse woody debris on the ground, particularly these ones that have tipped up. One thing that logging does a terrible job of mimicking is basically roots tipping. And we cut the trees off and we get a stump, we don't get that root tip. Well, there's several species. So like winter wrens will nest in those root rods. Those Canada warblers I mentioned, they'll nest up and under or in the little pockets where the roots got pulled out. Mid-stem breakage. This thing right here is a grouse drumming log. You can actually see some of the grouse feces on the log. Variable density across the stand, anywhere from pretty open to quite closed, and retaining individual dead trees on the site long-term for our cavity nesting animals and our bark foraging animals to use. Intentional openings within the stand, so you'll get baby trees to fill them, so you provide nesting habitat for many of our birds. and high structural diversity sites. You've seen this one earlier, that irregular shelter wood system is a very good one for creating that. Can be done in hardwood and conifer landscapes. And because of the difficulty in this actually working with the interaction, I'm just going to go through a few of these. If I look at a stand like this, this is an even age stand, really nice timber quality. The main missing thing in this is there's basically no baby trees on this site. This is another stand. This is an uneven age managed site. Extremely high quality timber, also has the problem, no baby trees. We have a solution for that, which is essentially logging these sites. And what I would like to do is give two quick example sites here. These are our field tour sites. And so the two field tours we're going to do, one is in Taylor County, or that we have proposed to do. One is in Taylor County and one is in the Village of Plover Conservancy. And this might help you all decide which one, if you want to go to them, which one you want to go to. So let's start with Taylor County. Taylor County is this is on the Taylor County forest, so the county forest land. And we marked this a few years ago. This was about half cut this past fall, early winter, and remaining part will be cut likely next year. So this thing features northern hardwood with oak and aspen. And so some things to point out on this site. There are pockets of this that are getting cut, coppice with reserves. So we're trying to get aspen to regenerate in it. There's large chunks of it, this green color, that are selection harvest, that uneven age management I talked about, with an effort to open up pockets to get those, early successional structures in them. We have pockets that are in pink that were overstory removal. At some point in the past, about 40 years ago, some sort of harvest happened there, which allowed a lot of oak to regenerate. So what you have is a lot of trees in this size, about 4 inches in diameter up to 8 or 10, that are absolutely beautiful, clean oak. And so releasing those so that they can dominate the site. Then there are pockets of young aspen, which were from a previous harvest that we did nothing within. And finally, pockets of shelterwood. When you look at this thing as a whole, the idea is to create about 10 to 20% very open conditions, 10 to 20% partially stocked conditions, so like about half the crown cover, and the rest of it to be thinned. And essentially what you can do with that is create some of the highest diversity sites possible for birds. So this is one of the sites, Taylor County site. Some focal species on those sites: ruffed grouse, woodcock, scarlet tanager, Blackburnian warbler, mourning warbler, wood thrush, and beery. And it's going to feature aspen coppice conversion to uneven age stand conditions from ones that are essentially second growth stands, overstory removal, and shelterwood. So that's site number one. And that's what it looks like. Those photos were literally shot on that site Monday. Site number two is Village of Plover Conservancy. Village of Plover Conservancy has the Little Plover River running through it. It is part of the overall Little Plover Watershed Enhancement Project. And it has a component of riparian forest, a component of sedge meadow that had been overgrown by buckthorn, which we were working on, and a component of upland forest. This site had some of the biggest buckthorn I've ever personally dealt with. I cut buckthorn in 2018, 19, and 2020. And then we went back to the site in winter and spring of 2024 and 2025 to do quite a bit of work on the site. We also had the 2019 windstorm to contend with, quite a bit of overstory damage. So the largest buckthorn I've ever personally cut was on this site. It was 86 years old and significantly more than 20 inches in diameter, just to give you an idea of how advanced the infestation was. And that brings me to the end of my presentation there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mike and Jason. This was really informative and just such a great presentation. I think now we will open it up for questions. If anybody's got any questions, you feel free to unmute, or you can drop questions in the chat, and Jason and Mike can answer anything that you might be interested in knowing more about.
Yeah, I saw the comment on Connecticut warblers. Jason, I'm gonna give a little bit more here and you tell me how this sounds. A lot of where they probably nest is up in parts of Canada where almost nobody actually looks for birds because they're literally associated with one of two habitats, jack pine, old jack pine with the blueberry understory, or kind of these like black spruce kind of wetlands. So those are your two environments. And they're a goofy bird because they feed in the complete opposite direction of almost every other bird. They like feed upward under a canopy of blueberries. So they're an unusual bird. And in Wisconsin, we may have had a few nesting in the past. Last year, as far as I know, I don't think they found any nesting in Wisconsin last year, if I remember correctly. So there probably still some nesting in Minnesota, but I don't go over there all that much. They're a neat little bird. Okay, so one question was, what was the name of the place in Taylor County? It's Taylor County Forest, and it's pretty close to Rib Lake, just to give you an idea of location.
And any other questions from the audience, feel free to unmute or drop in the chat. And just for your reference also, Tony dropped in the demographic survey, which you can find in the chat as well.
So considering that we have a couple of minutes of extra time here, I want to actually show something if this is okay. For those that have an interest, you should be seeing the website coming up for the Wisconsin Forestry Center. Jason, can you shake your head if you can see that? Okay. Our demonstration sites, at least a subset of them, are on here. We have a collection of forest management for wildlife habitat demonstration sites across Wisconsin. These things are mostly within the central and northern part of the state. And you're going to see where there's ones that say explore, you can literally click on it and find quite a bit of information. You'll see other ones that say coming soon. And I guess if I was to summarize this, our graphic designer changed jobs, and you can tell exactly how many of them that the graphic designer actually put in before she changed jobs. That's kind of where we're at, but the target's within the next few weeks or a month to have all these available. And just to give you an example of what is in here, this is the Clark County site, which is the one we just canceled. Presents the site, talks about how it fits within the county forest management plan, facts, the locations, where it's located, how big it is, what the specific management goals are, what were the focal species, any special considerations, conditions before management on individual sites, what management was implemented, what we got with it, what structural elements were created. So escape cover, bedding cover, and fawning cover for deer, thermal covers, forages, structural elements like young forest, older forest, reserve, and then a map that shows specifically where they're located and who our partners were. The idea behind this is for landowners that want to kind of see how this is going to look on their property before they commit to it, or for foresters who want to be able to show landowners this. And these are all wildlife habitat focused sites with each of the elements, kind of detailed. And for most of the ones on there, we have at least 2 years in neotropical migratory bird data. And in many cases, we have 3 or more years. So as an example, I've been doing weekly bird surveys, or about weekly, for the Minister Lake site, which is on there for several years, and literally Facebook posts for Central Wisconsin Environmental Station every week on the birds that use it. And so that is available to the public and is on the Wisconsin Forestry Center website.
Awesome. Thank you so much for providing that resource to everybody. So I think at this time, we're gonna close the webinar, say goodbye. Just remember, if you have registered for their field tours, please fill out that poll so we know what our final location is going to be. With that, we hope that everybody has a great weekend. We'll also kind of provide webinar participants a way to access the recording, hopefully sometime in the next 2 weeks here. So just be sure to check your inboxes, and anything that you want to say, Mike or Jason, before we close out officially.
Oh, thank you for your interest in it.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks to everybody for spending your Friday afternoon with us. We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. And we hope you all have a great weekend.